I'm Victoria Ballestero. I work with ATCS. I'm an operations manager in their Largo office in Maryland. We're headquartered out of Virginia, and we're a total consulting services firm that focuses on site civil engineering, land development, surveying, and transportation engineering. We kind of have the gamut of clients, so it's been a really exciting space to be in, and I'm happy to be back here at the Maryland Building Industry Association moderating this course that was revived about 5 years ago with a Fundamentals of Land Development program. So just to get a little bit of housekeeping out of the way, if you need the bathroom, go out this door, take a right. If you're more located on this side, you can go out this door and take a left. We'll be starting dinner nights for the next 5 Tuesdays at 5:30, and the program will begin at 6. We'll have one lecture that'll be about 50 minutes long with a 10-minute Q&A, followed by a second lecture that'll be 50 minutes long by another 10-minute Q&A. I think that covers our kind of housekeeping stuff. I think that everyone signed in if they needed to for real estate, PE, and LS credit. If you didn't, make sure that you get to the sign-in sheet, which is at the door before the program starts, because we'll be making these certificates for PE, LS, and LA credits during the presentation, and you'll get a hard copy of the certificate at the end of the program. The real estate credits will be issued by the Maryland Building Industry Association, and those will be issued digitally in a couple of weeks. So with that, I would like to introduce our first speaker of the evening. I don't think that he needs any introduction because he is preceded by his reputation and his bow tie. David Thaler is an industry leader in site civil engineering. He is the founding member and principal of DS Thaler and Associates, a site civil engineering firm and surveying firm located in Baltimore County that has been operating for the last 43 years, I think. They've had a big blowout party for their 40th a couple of years ago. Hopefully the 45th will be even bigger. David is known across the industry for his thought leadership and for his work as an engineer, and for also providing expert testimony in an array of cases. David has authored about 250 or more articles on engineering and surveying. He was named last year as Engineer of the Year, and we are so thankful to have him here today to kick off this seminar series and present kind of the fundamentals of land development. It's how a project works and the economics of a project. So, David?
Thank you, Victoria, for that lovely introduction. My mother would have been so proud tonight. This is the 5th year that we've done this program in this particular format. And it's been my pleasure to moderate it for all those 5 years. What we used to do is fundamentals 1 year and advanced principles the second year. We changed it a little bit. We're really doing the state of the state and the issues that affect land development in Maryland at this time. But I'm going to kick off with some really fundamental principles of land development, especially for some of the newer members. Really, what I'm going to talk about is what a land developer does, how he does it, and how you manage to stay in business without getting your teeth kicked in. So what is it that land developers do? Well, there was a time, and I remember it, when you could walk into the county offices and walk out with a permit, but those days are long gone. And today, land development is arguably one of the most highly regulated businesses. And even though building has become dominated by the national merchant builders, land development is still extremely local. But what a land developer does is he locates, ties up, and buys land, obtains the necessary entitlements and approvals, subdivides the land, and sometimes builds the project infrastructure and sells it to builders. The process of building is another interesting subject, but beyond the scope of this. Now, one entity seldom does all of these steps anymore. Back in the day, you'd buy a piece of property and you'd develop it and build a house. It doesn't work that way anymore. And you could think of the land development process as a spectrum of opportunity. Starts with raw land, a cornfield, preliminarily approved land. It has some level of preliminary approvals, a development plan or a preliminary plan. Subdivided land, it's got a record plat. Sometimes this is called shovel-ready or fully entitled. Most counties, you have to have it fully engineered in order to get a record plat. Baltimore County, for instance, you don't. You can get a record plat without your engineering. Then we have developed lots where all the roads, water, sewer are in place. And finally, we have improved land. And that's something built on. It could be in distressed condition, or it could be in a good condition. Now, needless to say, if you wanted to purchase a property, say a house or a 7-Eleven or whatever, and if the 7-Eleven had an existing lease on it, and if you do a reasonable due diligence, a home inspection, termite inspection, building code violations, etc., there's very little likelihood that the property can't be used for its intended purposes. But as you might expect, there is an inverse relationship between the level of risk of a property and its rewards as you go through this spectrum of opportunity. So with raw land, the risk is very high. It's less risk when the more approvals it gets. When it gets preliminary approval, it's much less risk when it's recorded and fully entitled, and much less risk when it's developed and in distressed or good condition. So that risk reduces as you go through this process. But not surprisingly, the rewards are inversely proportional to the risk. So as the risk goes down, the rewards go down as well. And the rewards are the highest with raw land, which is really essentially what we do. Now, if you've ever listened to Ed Gold talk at this program, what you would have heard him say when he's not throwing, bags of M&Ms at you, is that he'd say, what are home builders looking for? So I'm going to ask you the question. What are home builders, when home builders buy lots from land developers, what are they looking for? Certainty. You took the class. All right. If I had a bag of M&Ms, Matt, I'd throw it to you. Okay. And the price that home builders are willing to pay, again, is inversely proportional to the risk. So as the risk goes down, that is, as the certainty increases, the price for the lot goes up. Now, what I'm going to talk about tonight and next week as well is the many problems associated with land development. What the risk is, how to recognize the risk, and how to manage the risk. But first, why bother? Why do we bother doing land development? What are its benefits? Well, its benefits are pretty simple, but frankly, they're tremendous. So the first is that they're relatively high returns. But let me ask you a question. Kim, go to the next one. Let me ask you a question. I want to ask one of the ladies this, which has, in fact, you, Sally, I want to ask. Okay, which is worth more, a 10-carat diamond or 10 1-carat diamonds? Dum, bum, 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 bum.
10 1 carats.
No, I'm afraid. If you ever get engaged again, I would call me. I would advise a little bit. Actually, a 10-carat diamond is worth much more than 10, 1-carat diamonds because of its rarity. But which is worth, more? One 10-acre lot or 10 1-acre lots? Somebody else. Tom, which is worth more?
10 1-acre lots.
10 1-acre lots up. Sorry? That's really a great guess. The 10 1-acre lots are worth more, of course. Why? Because the first acre is, let's say, it's worth $100,000. The second acre might be worth $50,000. The third acre might be worth, $25,000 and maybe $10,000 for each acre. So it's that first acre, that the curtilage of the house, that gives you the most value. And so the value is created by the act of subdivision. And I call this fission. It's real estate fission. As we take a big property and divide it into a smaller property, it releases value. The fission of it releases value in the form of money. And this is exactly what's driven the subdivision process since James I gave the province of Maryland to George Calvert, and property has been subdivided and subdivided again. Now I want to give an example. So the returns can be really high in the real estate business, and especially in the land development business. And I want to use sort of this is a real example, and I'm hoping we're going to carry this through a little bit on the course. This happens to be a property of about 14 acres on Dogwood Road in Woodlawn, about 2 minutes away from my office. And go to the next one, Kim. And it was an old country club of all things. This is part of an old parking lot. It's very flat. It had an old single-family house that was the clubhouse on it. Go to the next one. Okay, and we were able to turn it into, ultimately, it's built now. I drove right by it on our way here. We were able to get it approved for and construct 59 townhouses on this property. So let's run through some I've sort of made this up a little bit, but not really. This is really typical for this property. So let's say, you got the potential of 59 lots. So let's say that could be put under contract for $1 million. And that there was a cash deposit. So we're going to buy the property when it's all ready to go, fully entitled and recorded for $1 million. Now let's assume, but we don't pay $1 million up front, we have to pay a deposit. So let's assume that the deposit is 5%, $50,000. That we've got a pretty cheap lawyer here, sorry Kevin, $20,000. The engineering is the environmental work is $10,000, the engineering is $150,000, and county fees and other fees total $240,000. I can barely see this from this angle, $240,000. So that would be the cost to get it fully entitled, to get it to a record plat. So what's our return? So let's just say we've laid out this in cash. Now we don't have to lay it out in cash. We could have a partner, an investor. We could borrow part of it. But let's assume we've laid out the entitlement cost of $240,000 in cash. Now the sales, and we sell it to Lennar, let's just say, for $2 million. That's not an unreasonable price. It's $33,000 a lot, raw, but approved, perfectly reasonable price. Our land cost is what we didn't put a deposit up for, $950,000. Closing is on the high side, 4%. Our entitlement from up here is $240,000, and we make a profit of $730,000. And what have we done? It's not so hard. We got a piece of paper. Okay, that's all we did. We had a contract, we got a piece of paper, and we laid out $240,000, and we made a profit. These are basically real numbers of $730,000, and our return is over 300%. Well, 10-year Ts this morning were just under 5%, so that's not a bad return. Fairly riskless in the scheme of things, because all you're going to really risk is part of your entitlement cost. And if you get into it and it blows up for whatever the reason, you walk away from it. So very good return. And that is the main reason that we're in the development business. Now, the second great benefit to being in the land development business is leverage, is the ability to borrow money. Now, the American finance system is almost unique in the world. You go to Europe and you pretty well have to pay cash for stuff. Britain isn't too bad. France is kind of all cash. And if an investor wanted to start any other kind of business, Tesla, you probably have to lay out $1 billion, to design a car, build a factory and get it staffed up. But in the real estate business, almost uniquely, the property itself serves as collateral. We're going to hear about this later. We're going to have the bankers come in and talk about how to finance real estate deals. But the property, you can typically borrow between 50 and 80% on a acquisition and development loan, somewhere in there. Now, back in the day, you guys don't remember Jeffrey Levitt, but I remember him well. You could borrow 110%, but he's in jail, out of jail, and those days are long gone. We better be satisfied with 50, 60, 70%. Now, the final benefit of land development is really, it's kind of easy, to tell you the truth. Many people work out of their basements. You do not need a big staff. You barely need an office. There are land development firms that are quite large, but you don't need to be. You can almost do this yourself. Now, a variety of talents, we can't quite do it yourself because you need certain talents from various professionals. At the very least, you need an engineer, sometimes a surveyor in the more rural counties, and you need a friendly banker or an investor. So, or a friendly father-in-law, whatever it takes. It's not difficult to get started. The more specialized professionals, a lawyer, the environmental specialist, geotechnical engineers, noise consultants, and lawyers, almost all of these are available for hire on a contract basis in almost every jurisdiction. And with knowledge, capital, almost anybody can develop land. And in the case of entitlements, you never have to close. Okay, and often the contract is flipped at the last. Entitlements are achieved, the contract is flipped, and somebody else closes, and you don't even have to close on the property. And so without moving, it's really magic to me. You get a piece of paper, we call it a record plat or a final plat of subdivision. It gets a signature on the bottom, and it's literally worth more than its weight in gold, because the property, without building a single thing, without moving a single yard of dirt, the property doubles, triples, whatever it is, in value. Well, those are the good reasons. And here's a typical development team of specialists that you might need. But the reason returns are so high, of course, is this is a very risky business. And it is easy to go bankrupt in this business, and many people have. It's inherently risky, and in order to be successful, I've been in the business basically, as D.S. Thaler & Associates for 42 years. I started when I was 14, basically. And it's, if you want to stay successful, it's important to understand the risk of the business and how to manage that risk. And in the immortal words of my friend Donald Rumsfeld, who I see down at Growls at St. Michael's all the time, our former Secretary of Defense, there are three types of risks: known knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns. This is why we lost in Vietnam, I guess, which are, and the unknown unknowns are the things we don't know. Now, there's actually a technical difference between risk and uncertainty. Risks are unknowns that have a measurable probability. What is the statistical probability that the county will approve my project? Well, usually that's pretty high. In the case of Baltimore County, it's probably 98%. But unknown unknowns are the things that we cannot anticipate happening, usually because they've never happened before. What is the likelihood of something occurring that's never occurred before? FRT plywood. All of a sudden, all the plywood that the builders used disintegrated, fell apart. An Ellicott City moratorium. It's been flooding at least since 1860, and now all of a sudden there's a moratorium in the entire drainage area. Impact fees in Baltimore County. My God, who would ever dream impact fees in Baltimore County is going to pass in the legislature in the next 2 weeks? Could not really be anticipated. And we call these things black swans. Anybody know why we call them black swans? Victoria, stop showing off. Okay, tell us why we call them black swans.
Prior to the existence of finding black swans in New Zealand, people thought only white swans existed.
That's exactly right. All the swans had been seen, in Europe, and there was no way to know that all swans were not white until the discovery of Australia and New Zealand. So how do we manage risk? The first thing, the most important thing, is know the rules. Don't play a game if you don't know the rules. I cannot overemphasize this enough. The key to success in any enterprise is to know the rules. And in this area, it's to know them better than the agency reviewers. Now, we find that most agency reviewers are very helpful. They do the best they can, but they often do not have the experience and the tenure that we have, and they don't know, they simply don't know all the rules, and sometimes you get wrong answers. Now, the second technique in managing risk is to have the proper team. Doesn't matter how smart you are, you can't know everything. You can't know everything in every jurisdiction. Every jurisdiction is different, and development is local. That's another thing I cannot emphasize enough. A lot of the rules are not written down. A lot of the rules are written in pencil in the margins, and a lot of the rules, just aren't written at all. For instance, on the little property we're talking about, the gross now in Baltimore County, you take the zoning, which in that case is DR 5.5, and you multiply by the gross acreage. So 5.5 times the 14 acres. The problem is the definition of gross acreage isn't written down anywhere. You have to know what it is, and it includes half the frontage of the property, whether you physically own that fee or not. You'll never find that in the zoning code. It's not there. You just have to know. And every jurisdiction is like that has rules and way they do business that you just need to be a local. And so it's very important to have a local engineer and or a local attorney who are familiar with the rules and the interpretation of the rules. Now, the next technique to manage risk, of course, is the feasibility study or the due diligence study. One should always undertake a due diligence study prior to purchasing land. I cannot tell you how many clients I've had who bought property at, say, an auction and closed and were in for a terrible surprise. In one case, in several cases, the property was completely undevelopable for ways they didn't fully understand, and they bought it at a tax sale, they bought it at auction. Do not be one of those people. Call me before you buy the property, not after you buy the property. And finally, the most powerful tool to manage risk, which we're going to hear about from Kevin Shepard in just a little bit, who is really one of Maryland's outstanding real estate attorneys, is the option contract, or it's the It's really a conditional. It's a conditional contract. Typically, I will buy the property subject to the following conditions, but it's really an option. Now, it looks like a contingent contract, and you're required to close when certain contingencies are fulfilled, but in truth, it's essentially an option. It allows you to back out if the conditions that you expect to be associated with the property turn out not to be the case. So let's turn quickly to the site analysis process. I'm just going to run through this quickly on some of the things that you should be aware of in a feasibility study. Now, typically, these include four things: the existing conditions, the site analysis, the context of the property, the existing conditions, the natural resources, a market analysis, a financial analysis, and not to be underestimated, especially today, a political analysis. And I'm a little mathematically oriented, so I like to think about it this way, that we really have four sets of constraints: physical constraints, financial constraints, market constraints, and political constraints. And what we're looking for is an intersection of all these constraints. But the important thing to remember is sometimes, maybe often, there is no intersection. And what do you do? What do you do in that case when you can't satisfy all the constraints? You walk, okay, see ya, or you renegotiate, which is more typical. Now let me briefly touch on each of these. So let me sort of start with marketing. We may hear about this more later in the course. This is not a course in marketing houses, but what most builders, well, first of all, you should analyze. You can't go into a property without analyzing the market. Most builders would tell you that the main drivers of the market, other than price, any problem can be fixed probably with a price adjustment, but the main drivers are the quality of the schools and the distance to the jobs. Typically, most people won't drive more than an hour to wherever the job centers are. If it's more than that, just look at West Virginia. You know, if it's more than that, you'll have difficulty selling houses at reasonable prices, and schools are, needless to say, a huge driver, and there are numerous online resources that can tell you the quality of the schools. But other things: who are the buyers, what can they afford, what's the demand, what amenities do they want, and what's the current supply, and most importantly, what's in the pipeline already. And there are a number of marketing firms that can tell you that, or you can go over to the county and check for yourself. Now, the next up is the financial analysis, of which I just did a little touch on. But needless to say, always run a pro forma. What will the land cost? What are the entitlements going to cost? What kind of loan can you get? How much loan to value? How much cash do you have to put in? And what are the fees that are going to be associated with it? And then next we come to analyzing the site itself, beginning with the existing conditions. And I'm going to go into much greater detail on this in the second part of this lecture, which will be the second half of next week. But these generally include the topography, the boundary, the environmental elements, and of course the zoning. So if you can, and this is how they sort of relate. The intersection of physical constraints and political constraints we call regulation, and so on. And if we can find a solution to all these four sets of constraints, we can have a job that meets your expected return and your risk tolerance, and you can go forward. Now, where's the process break down? Kind of the relatively minor things are excessive regulation, obsolete zoning, exactions, you misjudge the market, economic conditions. we should talk, economic conditions is a known unknown. As Jon Snow would say, winter is coming. Winter is always coming. Does everybody know who Jon Snow is? Okay, please. I don't have to explain Game of Thrones, do I? Winter is coming. There is a recession out there. Typically, recessions, in the real estate business come every 5 or 8 years and last for about a year. The Great Recession of 2008 lasted for arguably 7 years. I don't know when the next recession is going to be, and I don't know how deep it's going to be, but it's there. And we need to always be prepared for that. But of course, today we see more and more political community opposition and political opposition. This is the bumper sticker that I saw on the vice chair of a certain planning commission's car, and this was years ago. It's only gotten worse since then. The community opposition is, it's argued that it's usually overcrowded schools, too much traffic, we hear that all the time, and change in the character of the neighborhood. But it would be very naive for me and for all of us not to recognize that there is a real racial undertone to some community opposition. My office is holding a community input meeting tonight as we speak on a job in Owings Mills, and I was going to read this to you. This is an email that was sent to Baltimore County. It is the most racist, I can't read it to you. I can barely read it to myself. It is the most racist statement that I have ever seen about a little apartment job in Owings Mills, and the lady signed her name, and says she's moving to Columbia, and this is, and community opposition, which often, and racial undertones are not always racial. We've had big fights with the Catholics against the Jehovah's Witnesses, the Orthodox Jews against the conservative Jews, and very often these are interpersonal battles trying to keep out the wrong kind of people. We've had African American single family communities who fought against African American townhouse communities. So very often these are racially oriented, religiously oriented, and economically oriented. Now dealing, and so you just need to be aware of that. I've never had somebody sign their name to, I'm not quite sure what to do with it, but I've never had somebody, I would post it to humiliate her, but you can't do that. So more typically, the community opposition, there might be a racist undertone, but it's usually too much traffic or too much this or too much that. And there are a lot of techniques for handling community opposition. But the best one I think is this. We often convene community input meetings, and what developers like to do, our clients are, sort of all American, and they believe in, that they can want to do with their land, and so that they want to come into a community meeting and they want to say, this is a wonderful job, and here's all the wonderful things about this, and here's why you should support it. Well, the neighbors don't really want to hear what you have to say. They want you to hear what they have to say. And really the most powerful technique is to let people have their say with a understanding and a sympathetic ear, and it tends to drain the drama. Notifications go out, neighbors have never come together for years, they get all excited about a change in the neighborhood. You have the meeting, let them say what they want to say, listen to it, sometimes they have good ideas and adopt them. Now I want to talk a little bit about some of the regulations that apply to land development. I used to say there are two great bodies of law. For years I've sort of been giving versions of this talk, and I would say that there are two great bodies of law that apply to land development, both which were essentially adopted in the 1920s. Zoning, which was a federal was an enabling act, a standard state zoning enabling act, and the subdivision development process, which was the standard city planning enabling act. But in fact, there is a third body of law, and it's kind of crept up on us in the last 30 years or so, and that is state land use control. It kind of doesn't fit into any of these. Now, Maryland is what we call a strong county state. There's 23, I think, counties and Baltimore City, and each is pretty strong, has a big political presence, and has kept land use control largely in the hands of the counties. Pennsylvania, on the other hand, I think it has 360 boroughs and townships, and so the counties there are weak. Maryland has relatively very few municipalities. But over time, so that land use control has generally been vested in the counties and not the state. But over time, state land use control has become more and more prevalent. Now, Maryland adopted, next one, Kim. So over the first thing it did is in 1992, the legislature adopted a regulation which required the counties to have comprehensive plans. Many of them did, but it wasn't required before that time. And then over time, the state regulated tidal wetlands, then non-tidal wetlands, forests, as we may know, forest stand delineations, forest conservation, the Chesapeake Bay critical area. Chesapeake Bay critical area really controlled the 1,000 feet within the Chesapeake Bay, divided it into intensely developed, limited developed, and resource conservation areas. Resource conservation areas where one lot for every 20 essentially couldn't be developed. And then in 2012, Maryland adopted the Sustainable Growth and Agricultural Preservation Act, sometimes called the TIER Bill. And this was Governor O'Malley's kind of babies. It's almost, many governors, going back to Glendenning at least, have really wanted more statewide zoning and more statewide control. O'Malley got it with this act, which divided the entire state into tiers. Tier 1 were kind of urban areas, Tier 4 were rural areas, and in Tier 4, which was the rural and agricultural areas, you were restricted, no matter how big the property was, to not more than 7 lots, 3 in Baltimore County, to minor subdivisions. So you could have 1,000 acres in Baltimore County, you get 3 lots out of it. The state also adopted priority funding areas, and it required all the locals to map priority areas, and state funds could not be expended outside of those areas. So you couldn't get money for a new school outside of the priority funding areas, which were generally the development areas in the more urban and suburban areas. And finally, there was a case called Terrapin Run very recently in 2016. Terrapin Run in Allegheny County was basically a new town, a very large project that was completely outside of its comprehensive plan, and the court held that it could proceed. So the state adopted what was called the Smart Green Growing Plan Consistency Act, which essentially required all zoning and local approvals to be consistent with the comprehensive plan. Now, typically, the comprehensive plan was a guide and the zoning counted. So, you know, the master plan kind of had this kind of loose goals about what should happen, but what it was zoned counted. Now, but under the new law, I'm overstating it a little bit, essentially you have to be consistent with the comprehensive plan, even if the zoning would allow more development. And so over time, the state has become a major player in land use control, and that control has typically been in the counties, but is now a large part of that has moved to the state. Now I want to come back and talk about zoning a little bit, which has been with us for 102 years, although it feels like forever. Now it came to the scene rather suddenly in 1916, but I think it's a little bit important to understand the background and where it came from to understand where we are today. Next one, Kim. Okay, this is right off the web page of the Baltimore City Board of Municipal and Zoning Appeals. And this is what they say they want to do. The board has these general goals: prevent the overcrowding of land, avoid the undue concentration of population, provide adequate light and air, secure safety from fire panic, et cetera, et cetera. Now, why in Baltimore City, which loses about 1,000 residents a year, are you worried about preventing the overcrowding of land? You know, you tear down half of West Baltimore. Why are you worried about undue concentration of population? Baltimore City, not so long ago, was just under 1 million, and now it's about 620,000 people. Where does this come from? Doesn't strike you as odd? Well, here's where it comes from. In 1915, Colonel Thomas Coleman DuPont started construction of the Equitable Building, which was and is at 120 Broadway in New York City. This is 1915, mind you. It was colossal. It was and is colossal. It contained 1.2 million square feet of rentable space, and 16,000 employees worked there every day. And it cast a shadow halfway up a noonday shadow halfway up the island of Manhattan, and it created a virtual panic about what might happen if fire disgorged the thousands of employees onto the narrow streets of New York. A rather far-fetched concern until 9/11. And improbably, the solution was zoning. And so here's the preamble from the 1916 New York City zoning ordinance, the very first zoning ordinance in the country. Prevent the overcrowding of land and to avoid the undue concentration of population, secure safety from fire. This is, it is verbatim the same as the 2019 Baltimore City zoning. And this was designed, zoning was designed for Manhattan. The Equitable Building was built property line to property line with every inch, and it is still this zoning that we are using today. Now, there are two kinds of zoning that relate to us. There are a lot of kinds of zoning, but for our purposes, there's basically two. One is called Euclidean zoning. I'll tell you where this comes from in a minute, where use is the organizing principle. And the other that's kind of hot right now, there's also performance-based zoning, but form-based zoning is kind of hot right now, and that's where form or shape is the organizing principle. And now, why is it called Euclidean? Now, Euclid is a little township just east of Cleveland, and in the 1920s, industrial uses were moving out Euclid Avenue, which was the fancy street in Cleveland, and they passed a zoning ordinance modeled on the New York City 1916 ordinance. And this is the original zoning map of Euclid in 1922. And it zoned its land much like we do today. It zoned it U1, use 1 through use 6. In U1 you could have single family houses, in use 2 you could have townhouses, in use 3 and so on. Very much the way our zoning is today. Now Ambler Realty had a property on which it wanted to develop for industrial purposes. And if it developed for industrial purposes, it was worth $80,000 an acre. I'm not sure I remember that right. But it got zoned for residential purposes that was only worth $20,000 an acre. And it went to the Supreme Court. And the question was that a taking? Was that rezoning, that downzoning, a taking under the Fifth Amendment of the United States? And somewhat surprisingly, because the court was very conservative at that time, the court upheld that zoning was constitutional under the Fifth Amendment, and that zoning as a legislative act is not a taking. So I want to go very briefly into the elements of Euclidean zoning. It's, for years I spelled it I-A-N. It's actually E-A-N, don't ask me why. But it's E-A-N on the end. Now the first element is use. Now either a use is permitted or it's not. It's in or it's out. And so under Euclidean ordinances, which is what almost all the Maryland counties have, there are a few exceptions, but very few, your use that you want has to be specifically listed. And they come in two flavors. The uses can be as of right, or they can be sometimes called conditional uses, also known as special exceptions. And there's nothing special about them actually, and there's nothing exception about them. They're just certain uses that are allowed all the time, and certain uses, the special exceptions or conditional uses, which have to meet an additional set of circumstances. Now, in every zoning ordinance, there's some provision to control density or intensity. And this is done in one of two ways. Some, like Baltimore County, which is a little unusual, uses something called density residential. You take the gross area, of course gross area isn't defined, you have to know what it is. It's not the net area, it's the gross area. You get a little freebie they don't tell you about, and you multiply this by the permitted, by the zoning, and that gives you your allowable density. But that's a little bit unusual. More typical is the density is controlled by minimum lot size. So you might have a property which is zoned R10,000 or R10 or whatever it is, and you're required therefore to have a lot of a minimum of 10,000 square feet or something like that. And that is typically how most jurisdictions control their density. And you might have to take out the environmental areas, you might have to take out the wetlands or the floodplains or the steep slopes or the whatever, but that's the typical way density is controlled. Now in commercial areas, it's controlled by floor area ratio, known as FAR, which is the permitted floor area over the area of the lot. And so in Baltimore City, would be typical, you might have a permitted FAR of 10. So if you had a 10,000 square foot lot, you would be permitted to build 1,000 square feet of buildings. Now there are also bulk regulations, which include setbacks, height restrictions, minimum lot yards, yard areas, and the like. Now, special exceptions are a little bit sort of tricky. For a special exception to be denied, it just can't be a bad use. It has to be worse at this particular site that you're interested in than all the other sites in the zone. For instance, in the seminal case is a funeral home. Okay, so a funeral home is a special exception in, I think it was Carroll County. So if you want a funeral home, you can't just say a funeral home is bad, it has emanations or traffic or whatever it is, because it's permitted by the legislature as a special exception. It has to be worse at your particular site than any other site. So it's not the inherent characteristics of the conditional use that matter. It's will it be worse on this particular site than other sites? That's not particularly well understood, and so it's kind of hard, most counties, to lose a special exception, because that's a pretty high burden for the opposition to overcome. Now, for zoning to be constitutional, it must allow for hardships, and it must allow for variances. Now, in Maryland, variances are strictly controlled by a case called Cromwell v. Ward, and this is a 1995 case that comes out of Rogers Forge in Baltimore County near Towson. Rogers Forge has like 1,000 townhouses that are peas in a pod. They look built by Kilty, one of our members, look exactly the same. Guy wanted to put an addition on. I think it was a wine cellar. He wanted to put an addition on. This was Mr. David Cromwell, wanted to put the addition on, and he applied for a variance. And the court said, there's nothing special. There's nothing special about this site. And so in this case, the Cromwell v. Ward, the court established a two-pronged test for variances, which is Maryland law. It was Judge Cathell, if I remember correctly, who wrote the opinion. First, to have a variance, the site must be unique. And then second, there must be a practical difficulty or unreasonable hardship. Now, what's a practical difficulty? A practical difficulty is some unique characteristic that prevents you from doing what you could have otherwise done legally on the site. That's a practical difficulty. So this has been litigated a fair amount. There's a brand new case on it from the fall. It's called Dan's Mountain versus Allegheny County. And this clarified a little bit variances. Many jurisdictions say it has to be unique or unusual or peculiar or words similar. And the Court of Appeals have said the words are all the same. There has to be something unique, peculiar, unusual about the property to entitle you for the variance, and then there has to be a nexus between that and the practical difficulty. The practical difficulty is created by the unique circumstances. And I think I'm right on time. We'll stop here for on zoning. We will pick up, I'll pick up the second half next week in how to go through a property and do a feasibility study, and then I'll talk about processing and some tricks to get your plans approved. Questions? Matthew?
Special exception, you said it has to be worse at your site than any other site within the zone. Does that site have to be available that you're comparing it to, or?
No, it's really rhetorical. It's not the inherent. It's not the. Let's say you have a mega church. Okay, it's not that the mega church generates traffic, because it's already presumed to be allowed by the legislature by making it a conditional use. It's that the traffic at that particular location, the road is bad or the intersection is bad, makes it unsuitable. And there was a big case called Loyola a couple years ago that established that principle. And that's not well understood. Anybody else? Come on, somebody got to have a question. You've got a question. Anybody else? Okay. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, David. I think that was a great introduction into the course that we'll be hosting for the next 5 weeks. Just going to do a couple of housekeeping things again as we do a mic switch here between our two presenters. Did everyone sign up for PE credits, real estate credits, and LS credits that needs to? Either a binder or the paper? Okay. Just to spend some time here, how many people are here from the land development developer side of the industry? Raise your hands high. Can't see. Okay, cool. How many people here are from the engineering side? Okay, so we've got a good mix of engineers and developers. How about landscape architects? See these folks up front, and surveyors. Got one over here. Awesome. So hopefully over the course of the next 5 weeks, everyone will kind of get to know each other, and this will also be a good opportunity to do some networking and to build some relationships across the industry.